When the first modern humans reached the combined landmass of Australia and New Guinea more than 50,000 years ago, the planet was colder, the oceans were lower, and the northern edge of Australia blended effortlessly into the rugged mountains of New Guinea. Rivers wound their way across a single enormous continent that scientists now call Sahul. Those early travelers carried something entirely new to the far edge of the Pacific: boats, advanced tool-making, a sense of direction that stretched far beyond the visible horizon, and the emotional courage it takes to push out across open water into what looked like endless emptiness. What came after their arrival became one of the longest, most continuous cultural histories on Earth. Long before cities rose along the Tigris or the Nile, long before farming reshaped the Fertile Crescent or East Asia, the descendants of these first voyagers were living on the sandstone cliffs of Arnhem Land, along the northern coasts of Australia, and deep within the cloud-wrapped valleys of the New Guinea highlands. But the story of Sahul didn't move in a single straight line. It branched. Around 37,000 years ago, the peoples of New Guinea and Australia began to separate, not just in biology, but in culture. The now submerged northwest shelf, which once connected the Kimberley, northern Australia, and western Arnhem Land, was a vast open landscape during the late Pleistocene, exposed whenever sea levels dropped. Some communities remained hunter-gatherers on the coasts and grasslands, building intricate spiritual and territorial systems. Others, especially in the New Guinea highlands, became horticulturalists whose evolving relationship with tropical plants eventually produced one of the earliest independent origins of agriculture on Earth. Still others, particularly those living along the coasts of New Guinea and the island chains stretching eastward, became skilled seafarers whose deep understanding of the ocean allowed them to settle faraway islands beyond the continental shelf. Together, these different lifeways point to something remarkable: a complex, structured world that thrived long before the seas rose and drowned the heart of Sahul. The plains, valleys, and shorelines where these ancestors lived now lie beneath the Arafura Sea, the Gulf of Carpentaria, and the Torres Strait. What disappeared under those waters wasn't just land. It may represent a lost ancient world, not a civilization of palaces or written scripts, but something deeper: shared knowledge, long-term settlement, wide-ranging exchange networks, and cultural continuity that lasted tens of thousands of years. To understand that lost world, the starting point isn't ruins or inscriptions, it's people, languages, genetics, and the landscapes they shaped. Archaeological sites across northern Australia and New Guinea contain tools, pigments, and hearths that testify to the earliest modern humans in this region. Places like Majabebe in Australia hold occupation layers older than 50,000 years, among the earliest evidence of humans outside Africa and the Near East. And these ancient settlers could not have reached Sahul without watercraft. Even at the lowest sea levels, Asia and New Guinea were never fully joined. Stretches of water always remained between the islands of Indonesia and the Sahul Shelf. Whoever made that crossing did it deliberately, using boats capable of handling strong currents, shifting winds, and unpredictable seas. Their presence proves a sophisticated maritime intelligence, the ability to imagine lands beyond sight, and the cooperation required to plan and complete such journeys. For tens of thousands of years, the people of Sahul lived in a deeply connected world. A person could travel on foot from the shores of modern Queensland into the river valleys of southern New Guinea, or from Australia's central deserts to the lower slopes of the Papua New Guinea highlands. With sea levels far lower than today, the region exposed vast grasslands, wetlands, and river systems where fish, shellfish, and large animals were abundant. Across this landscape, early Sahulians formed networks of movement, trade, and intermarriage that wove the entire continent into a single, interlinked cultural fabric. But that unity, like much of the ancient world, did not last forever. Genetic evidence shows that around 37,000 years ago, the shared population of ancient Sahul split into two major lineages: One group would become the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, while the other became the Papuans of New Guinea and the surrounding islands. Why this division happened is still uncertain, but geography was almost certainly a driving force. As shifting climates transformed forests and wetlands, the rising highlands of New Guinea grew into an increasingly isolated world. Over thousands of years, those mountain valleys turned into self-contained cultural regions, each developing its own dialects, alliances, and traditions. Meanwhile, in Australia, the expanding deserts and grasslands shaped movement, social networks, and survival strategies. This separation represents one of the oldest deep population splits among modern humans outside Africa. It suggests that by the end of the Pleistocene, the ancestors of Aboriginal Australians and Papuans were already forming distinct cultural identities, even though the land around them was still physically connected. This leads to a central question: where and when did Papuans encounter the Denisovans? Genetics offers an intriguing clue. The data indicates that male Denisovans interbred with modern human females, hinting that these encounters may have taken place as small groups of humans first crossed Wallace's line and entered Denisovan territory. Within this story appears a mysterious population known only through DNA, a branch called D1 Denisovans. Their genetic signature still appears in the people of New Guinea today, but their story isn't found in the icy caves of Siberia or the limestone chambers of China. It lives in the dense mountain spine of New Guinea, where modern humans seem to have met an isolated remnant of an ancient world. Recent genomic studies show that this encounter happened surprisingly late, after the first settlers of Sahul had already begun splitting into separate Papuan and Australian groups. The most striking detail is that this D1 lineage carries no Neanderthal ancestry at all, setting it apart from every other known Denisovan population. Its remaining genetic footprint survives almost entirely in the remote interior of Papua New Guinea. This discovery raises a bold possibility. The last surviving Denisovans may not have lived in Siberia or northern China, but in the tropical highlands of ancient New Guinea. Their final interbreeding with modern humans, likely between 30,000 and 20,000 years ago, happened when the Papuan and Australian branches of Sahul's original population were already drifting apart. Geography alone didn't create this divide. Climate shifts, rugged landscapes, and human movement patterns shaped a unique final moment of contact between our species and theirs, and Denisovan history was far more complex than originally believed. Just like modern humans, they were diverse, splitting into several deep and ancient lineages. The best-known group, called D0, is the one identified from remains in the Denisova cave of Siberia. But the genetic traces found in living populations show that this Siberian group was only one fragment of a much larger Denisovan world. Across New Guinea and parts of eastern Indonesia, people carry DNA from at least two other Denisovan lineages called D1 and D2. These lineages diverged from one another roughly 250,000 to 300,000 years ago, long before the ancestors of modern humans ever left Africa. Their biggest difference is their relationship to Neanderthals. D2, which mixed with early Australians, carries a clear Neanderthal genetic signal. D1 does not. That single detail reveals something profound about D1's past. Neanderthal Denisovan contact happened on the Asian mainland, most likely in the mountains of Central Asia or Western China. If D1 lacks that Neanderthal signature, then its ancestors must have been isolated before that interbreeding event. To avoid that genetic exchange, the D1 lineage must have moved eastward into Southeast Asia or towards Sahul very early, possibly more than 150,000 years ago. During a cold period between about 190,000 and 130,000 years ago, sea levels were extremely low, creating pressure to migrate south into warmer regions. Whether D1 Denisovans actually reached Sahul itself or only moved into the island chains between Asia and Australia remains uncertain. But once they found refuge, rising and falling seas likely trapped them in place. Over tens of thousands of years, the D1 Denisovans vanished from mainland Asia, surviving only in the rugged landscapes of what would eventually become New Guinea. And when sea levels fell during the last ice age, the exposed Arafura Shelf connected Australia and New Guinea once again, forming the single vast continent of Sahul. This moment reshaped the entire region. What had once been a chain of islands divided by deep ocean channels turned into one continuous stretch of land, a broad plain with dense rainforest in its interior. For the humans who arrived around 50,000 years ago, Sahul was an unfamiliar continent filled with giant animals, strange ecosystems, and small, isolated pockets of archaic hominins. Genetic evidence shows that within only a few thousand years, these first Sahul populations began to diversify. Groups who moved into the dry Australian interior followed a path very different from those who stayed in the river valleys and rugged highlands of northern Sahul. By about 37,000 years ago, the divide had grown deeper. The ancestors of modern Papuans and Aboriginal Australians had become genetically distinct, even though the land they lived on was still physically connected. Long after that split was underway, Papuan ancestors encountered and interbred with the Denisovans, not with the Neanderthal-linked D2 Denisovans, who had already mixed with Sahul's earliest settlers, but with the much older, more isolated D1 population. And that meeting didn't happen along the coasts where early travelers first arrived. It happened inland, high in the mountains where cloud forests cling to steep slopes and the landscape rises into the cold, dramatic interior of New Guinea. As global temperatures began to rise after 40,000 years ago, ice sheets shrank and sea levels slowly climbed. Northern Australia and southern New Guinea were still connected by land, but the environments began to shift. In New Guinea, coastal groups started moving upriver into the interior. The cool, fertile highland valleys, protected, productive, and safer from coastal disease, became ideal places to settle. But these valleys were naturally isolated, often encircled by sharp, towering ridges that acted like walls. Over time, those same barriers helped create the extraordinary cultural and linguistic diversity the region is known for today. New Guinea now hosts more than 800 languages. The northern half of Papua stayed a dense tropical forest, while the southern side developed into open woodland and savanna. And when the first Papuan ancestors entered these fertile valleys, they did not arrive to empty land. Somewhere in this rugged landscape, in forests overlooking the Tari Basin or on plateaus above the Wagi Valley, the last D1 Denisovans were still alive. Their numbers were likely very small. They may have survived in scattered family groups, hunting marsupials, digging up roots, and living deep in the interior, where outsiders seldom traveled. The encounter between modern humans and this archaic population was not a sweeping migration wave. It was personal. A few marriages, maybe only a handful, were enough to leave genetic traces that remain today. This mirrors many other hybridization events in human history. Even a small number of unions can leave a profound genetic legacy if they occur in a small, isolated population. The D1 genetic signal in Papuans fits a pattern of male-biased introgression. In many Highland societies, both ancient and more recent, marriage tends to follow a patrilocal system. Men stay in their home territory, while women move to join their husband's group. If ancient social patterns were similar, a Denisovan male marrying a modern human woman or taking a wife from a nearby group could leave descendants rooted in the same highland valleys for generations. Over time, those family lines could grow while the original Denisovan paternal lines faded, blending into the population but never completely disappearing. The absence of Denisovan Y chromosome evidence raises a question: why is it missing? What seems to have happened in Papuan genomes today is that D1 and D2 both survived, but their histories are completely different. D2 is older, tied to the very first entry into Sahul and Sunda around 46,000 years ago. It left its imprint not only in New Guinea, but also in Australia. And the D2 fragments contain Neanderthal ancestry, reflecting that lineage's long history on the Asian mainland. D1, however, is far more restricted. It appears strongly only in New Guinea and in smaller amounts on nearby islands. It entered modern human populations much later, roughly 20,000 to 30,000 years ago, long after the Papuan and Australian branches had already begun to separate. This shows that the Denisovan story in Sahul wasn't a single episode but two. The first occurred soon after modern humans stepped onto Sahul when they encountered the D2 Denisovans. Then, many thousands of years later, a second encounter unfolded deep inland, at a time when communities across Sahul were already becoming culturally and genetically distinct. Australia never inherited the D1 signal, not because rising seas had already isolated it, those waters would not flood back for many millennia, but because its people simply did not move back into the mountainous interior of New Guinea where D1 still survived. Human separation, not geography, explains the difference. The result is a remarkable genetic pattern. Aboriginal Australians carry only the older 2 introgression. Highland Papuans carry both, layered in their DNA like stacked archaeological deposits. But who exactly were the D1 Denisovans? The truth is that we may never know in a physical sense. No Denisovan remains have been identified anywhere in Sahul. The Pleistocene bones of New Guinea are rare, and the acidic soils of the highlands destroy organic material quickly. Yet their genetic legacy suggests a population that had been isolated for at least 200,000 years, evolving far to the east of all other Denisovan groups. Their complete lack of Neanderthal ancestry is astonishing. It implies that long before Neanderthals and the Siberian or East Asian Denisovans mixed, the D1 lineage had already slipped out of reach. To survive, they must have found a refuge strong enough to keep the wider world away. The islands beyond Wallace's line, separated by fierce currents and harsh ecological barriers, may have offered exactly that sanctuary. When modern humans finally arrived in their territory, it was not a meeting of equals. The Denisovan population was likely small, the human population far larger. Their worlds merged quietly, without leaving artifacts, legends, or cultural hallmarks we can recognize today. Only genes remain. The D1 ancestry in Highland Papuans is modest, a few percent scattered like faint brushstrokes from a vanished hand, but faint does not mean insignificant. These fragments may have shaped physiology, contributing to immunity, metabolism, or Highland adaptation. In a place defined by malaria, steep terrain, and shifting climate, even subtle genetic advantages could matter. By 20,000 years ago, everything was changing again. The last glacial maximum tightened its grip on the planet, and people across Sahul withdrew into safer refuges. When the ice began to melt after 18,000 years ago, sea levels rose and the Torres Strait flooded, finally dividing Australia from New Guinea. By that time, the D1 Denisovans were gone. Their last exchange with modern humans had taken place thousands of years earlier, and their remaining communities probably vanished soon afterward. Today, the people of New Guinea speak hundreds of languages and follow lifeways shaped by one of Earth's most dramatic landscapes. Their genetic diversity is among the highest known anywhere. Within that diversity sits a preserved timeline, a record reaching back tens of thousands of years, long before farming, pottery, or the first mammoth hunters entered the Americas. Aboriginal Australians had become genetically distinct, even though the land they lived on was still physically connected. Long after that split was underway, Papuan ancestors encountered and interbred with the Denisovans, not with the Neanderthal-linked D2 Denisovans, who had already mixed with Sahul's earliest settlers, but with the much older, more isolated D1 population. And that meeting didn't happen along the coasts where early travelers first arrived. It happened inland, high in the mountains where cloud forests cling to steep slopes and the landscape rises into the cold, dramatic interior of New Guinea. As global temperatures began to rise after 40,000 years ago, ice sheets shrank and sea levels slowly climbed. Northern Australia and southern New Guinea were still connected by land, but the environments began to shift. In New Guinea, coastal groups started moving upriver into the interior. The cool, fertile highland valleys, protected, productive, and safer from coastal disease, became ideal places to settle. But these valleys were naturally isolated, often encircled by sharp, towering ridges that acted like walls. Over time, those same barriers helped create the extraordinary cultural and linguistic diversity the region is known for today. New Guinea now hosts more than 800 languages. The northern half of Papua stayed a dense tropical forest, while the southern side developed into open woodland and savanna. And when the first Papuan ancestors entered these fertile valleys, they did not arrive to empty land. Somewhere in this rugged landscape, in forests overlooking the Tari Basin or on plateaus above the Wagi Valley, the last D1 Denisovans were still alive. Their numbers were likely very small. They may have survived in scattered family groups, hunting marsupials, digging up roots, and living deep in the interior, where outsiders seldom traveled. The encounter between modern humans and this archaic population was not a sweeping migration wave. It was personal. A few marriages, maybe only a handful, were enough to leave genetic traces that remain today. This mirrors many other hybridization events in human history. Even a small number of unions can leave a profound genetic legacy if they occur in a small, isolated population. The D1 genetic signal in Papuans fits a pattern of male-biased introgression. In many Highland societies, both ancient and more recent, marriage tends to follow a patrilocal system. Men stay in their home territory, while women move to join their husband's group. If ancient social patterns were similar, a Denisovan male marrying a modern human woman, or taking a wife from a nearby group, could leave descendants rooted in the same highland valleys for generations. Over time, those family lines could grow, while the original Denisovan paternal lines faded, blending into the population but never completely disappearing. The absence of Denisovan Y chromosome evidence raises a question: why is it missing? What seems to have happened in Papuan genomes today is that D1 and D2 both survived, but their histories are completely different. D2 is older, tied to the very first entry into Sahul and Sunda around 46,000 years ago. It left its imprint not only in New Guinea, but also in Australia. And the D2 fragments contain Neanderthal ancestry, reflecting that lineage's long history on the Asian mainland. D1, however, is far more restricted. It appears strongly only in New Guinea and in smaller amounts on nearby islands. It entered modern human populations much later, roughly 20,000 to 30,000 years ago, long after the Papuan and Australian branches had already begun to separate. This shows that the Denisovan story in Sahul wasn't a single episode but two. The first occurred soon after modern humans stepped onto Sahul, when they encountered the D2 Denisovans. Then, many thousands of years later, a second encounter unfolded deep inland, at a time when communities across Sahul were already becoming culturally and genetically distinct. Australia never inherited the D1 signal, not because rising seas had already isolated it, those waters would not flood back for many millennia, but because its people simply did not move back into the mountainous interior of New Guinea, where D1 still survived. Human separation, not geography, explains the difference. The result is a remarkable genetic pattern. Aboriginal Australians carry only the older D2 introgression. Highland Papuans carry both layered in their DNA like stacked archaeological deposits. But who exactly were the D1 Denisovans? The truth is that we may never know in a physical sense. No Denisovan remains have been identified anywhere in Sahul. The Pleistocene bones of New Guinea are rare, and the acidic soils of the highlands destroy organic material quickly. Yet their genetic legacy suggests a population that had been isolated for at least 200,000 years, evolving far to the east of all other Denisovan groups. Even after the last traces of the Highland Denisovans faded, the echoes of their presence continued to ripple through the people who inherited their genes. Over thousands of years, communities in the Papuan highlands adapted to steep slopes, thin air, unpredictable rainfall, and dense forests that could swallow sound. These were places where isolation wasn't just geographical. It shaped identity, language, and biology. And within that isolation, the ancient genetic layers left by D1 and D2 remained protected, carried quietly from parent to child. As populations grew and scattered across the valleys, people developed technologies suited to their world: stone pestles, intricate hunting tools, brilliant taro farming systems carved directly into mountainsides. None of these traditions came from the Denisovans directly. The archaeological record shows no sign of shared culture, but the ability to thrive in such rugged environments may have been strengthened by the small, persistent legacy of those archaic ancestors. While these highland societies blossomed, the world beyond them was changing quickly. Sea levels rose high enough to redraw coastlines across the globe, drowning land bridges, cutting off islands, and isolating entire populations. New Guinea, once connected to Australia, became its own world. Great river systems shifted their paths, the coasts transformed into mangrove labyrinths. Yet deep inland, the mountains stayed timeless. Every lineage carries memories, but the Pacific holds some of the oldest. The people of the highlands tell stories of ancestors who emerged from stone, from forests, from hidden places beneath the earth. None of these tales explicitly describe Denisovans, but the feeling is unmistakable, a sense that humans were not the first to walk these mountains, a feeling that something older lived here long before them. As global human migrations continued through Central Asia, across the Bering Land Bridge, into the Americas, the highlands of Papua remained one of the world's great refugees. Hundreds of languages took shape, each belonging to groups separated by ridges, rivers, or ancient rivalries. And through those languages, fragments of worldviews survived that no outside culture could easily interpret. But time does not freeze even in remote places. Trade routes formed between valleys, knowledge spread about rare stones, feathers, and food crops. With each interaction, genes mixed and traditions evolved. Still, the D1 ancestry endured, surviving not because it was dominant, but because it was deeply embedded, woven into the core of populations who had never left their ancestral mountains. Modern DNA sequencing has become the new archaeology for these unseen histories. By comparing thousands of genomes, scientists have been able to piece together events that left no tools, no footprints, no cave art. And what they found was astonishing, a timeline stretching far beyond the first fire pits or the earliest burial sites, reaching into a period when humans shared the world with cousins they barely understood. This is where the next chapter begins, not with bones, but with patterns, with tiny strands of ancient code that endured through climate shifts, volcanic eruptions, and countless generations. They are windows into a time when the human family tree was not a simple trunk, but a tangled forest full of branches that touched, divided, or disappeared. The story of the Denisovans in Sahul is not just about who they were, it's about how deeply their presence shaped what came after. And it's about how much of that story remains hidden. What makes the Denisovan story so mysterious is not just how little we know about them, but how much they shaped us without ever leaving a clear footprint behind. They were a population that lived and vanished almost entirely in silence. No art, no carvings, no burial sites, no villages frozen in time. All that remains is the faintest genetic residue, signal so thin that only modern sequencing technology could reveal their existence at all. It is strange to imagine an entire lineage of humans who slipped through the world without leaving a physical trace, yet influenced the people who came after them in ways no one could have predicted. But that is exactly what the D1 Denisovan story represents. A chapter of human evolution built from whispers instead of artifacts. Geneticists often describe the Denisovan signature in New Guinea as a shadow. It sits behind the more dominant layers of modern human ancestry, behind the Neanderthal traces shared by all non-Africans, behind the adaptations gained through thousands of years of life in the tropics. But the shadow is unmistakable. It has a distinct structure, a rhythm in the genome that suggests a long period of isolation, so long, in fact, that D1 split from other Denisovan groups before Neanderthals and modern humans even met in Eurasia. That means that while early humans were spreading into the Near East and Europe, and while Neanderthals were adapting to colder and colder climates, the D1 ancestors were living in a completely different world, warm, humid, mountainous, and cut off. Their survival depended not on building shelters for the cold, but on navigating forests, steep ridges, and dangerous animals found only beyond Wallace's line. These islands and ecological barriers created a natural fortress. Ocean currents were fierce, the land was rugged, and the mix of predators and diseases made long-term settlement difficult for any early humans passing through. Yet D1 persisted there, generation after generation, long enough to evolve separately from their Denisovan relatives in mainland Asia. By the time modern humans finally pushed into Sahul, the D1 population was already ancient and likely small. Their world was shrinking. Rising seas were isolating pockets of land, and competition for resources made life increasingly fragile. So when Homo sapiens arrived, the encounter was deeply uneven. Thousands of modern humans moving along coasts and river valleys, compared to the scattered remnants of a lineage that had never been numerous to begin with. There may have been curiosity, conflict, fear, or even brief cooperation between the groups, but whatever form those interactions took, they left no visible cultural imprint. No hybrid tools, no shared symbolic traditions, only the genetic echo of unions that happened in moments we cannot reconstruct, but can still detect tens of thousands of years later. In the highlands, where isolation shaped nearly everything, the D1 signal endured. Modern Papuan ancestors inherited small pieces of DNA that subtly influenced their immune systems and their ability to thrive at altitude. These changes didn't make them Denisovan, they made them more resilient versions of themselves, better able to survive the challenges of the landscape around them. Over time, these genetic advantages helped anchor populations in the mountains. Communities began to settle permanently, building deep cultural and linguistic traditions that would persist for tens of thousands of years. Each valley became a world of its own, separated by geography, but connected through ancestry that stretched back to encounters no one remembered. What makes this story extraordinary is not just its age, but the fact that humans today carry living proof of it. A forgotten population, one that left no bones for archaeologists to find, still influences people walking the ridgelines of Papua, tending gardens, speaking languages with ancient roots, and passing on the same genetic fragments that have survived since the Pleistocene. The D1. Denisovans may be invisible in the archaeological record, but in the genome they are unmistakably present. Their legacy is both fragile and enduring. Fragile because so little evidence of their daily lives remains, and enduring because pieces of them still exist within millions of people. And in a way, that makes them more real than ever. They were never ghosts. They were humans, strange, distant, and beautifully resilient, who carved out a life on the edges of the world long before history began. The question now is what other ancient signatures might still be waiting in our DNA, waiting for the moment when technology becomes sharp enough to notice them. When we talk about the ancient world, we tend to imagine a map that looks familiar, continents with clear shapes, seas in their proper places, islands where we expect them to be. But during the time when D1 Denisovans survived in the deep interior of New Guinea, the world looked completely different. Coastlines stretched far beyond where modern beaches lie. Rivers flowed through lands that are now drowned beneath warm tropical seas. Forests grew where entire archipelagos stand today. This shifting world played a major role in separating human populations, not through choice but through geography itself. After 40,000 years ago, as the planet slowly warmed, melted ice filled the oceans. The sea began to rise, islands merged and then split again. Lowland plains disappeared underwater, and the massive continent of Sahul, once a continuous span of Australia, New Guinea and Tasmania, began to crumble into the boundaries we know now. People living across this vast region experienced those changes differently depending on where they lived. Along the coast, communities were constantly adapting to the encroaching water, moving inland, abandoning old settlements and establishing new ones upriver. But in the highlands, where dramatic valleys cut deep into the earth and mountains rose into the clouds, life remained relatively stable. These valleys became long-term sanctuaries, offering fertile soil, dependable rainfall, and enough isolation to protect people from the worst environmental shifts happening below. This isolation mattered. It shaped culture, language, and genetics in ways that still show today. Each valley functioned like its own micro-world. Groups rarely moved far beyond their ridges and passes. Some valleys held only a few hundred people, others a few thousand, but all were separated enough that unique traditions, myths, and languages developed independently. In this environment, even small genetic contributions, like those from the D1 Denisovans, could become deeply embedded. A few unions with a tiny archaic population could echo for thousands of years simply because the communities that carried those genes remained geographically anchored. They didn't spread outward in great migrations, they stayed where their ancestors had lived, letting those ancient signatures travel only vertically through generations rather than horizontally across wide regions. Meanwhile, the rest of Sahul was experiencing a very different story. In Australia, people adapted to deserts, bushlands, and the harsh variability of the continent. Their genetic heritage reflects the older D2 Denisovan introgression from the earliest arrivals, but nothing from the later D1 encounter. This absence tells us something important. The people who met D1 Denisovans never travelled back across the land bridge before it flooded. They stayed in New Guinea's mountains, while Australia's populations followed their own path of isolation. By 20,000 years ago, the world entered the coldest phase of the last ice age, the last glacial maximum. Sea levels plummeted, deserts expanded, wildlife shifted its patterns. But in the New Guinea highlands, the valleys remained refuges of relative stability. Even as the climate changed, these sheltered pockets supported communities who continued cultivating the land, hunting, gathering, and maintaining rich cultural traditions. It is in this time frame that the D1 Denisovan legacy quietly rooted itself. While the archaic population itself was likely fading from the world, small groups disappearing into history, their genetic contributions were becoming part of the foundation of highland populations. For them, survival depended on every advantage they could inherit: resistance to disease, tolerance for altitude, or greater resilience in rugged environments. Even minor genetic boosts mattered in these landscapes. The story of D1 is therefore not only about an ancient hominin group, it is about the human populations who encountered them and carried their legacy forward. The highlands became a cradle of long-term continuity. Generation after generation lived in the same valleys, built gardens on the same slopes, and passed down stories, knowledge, and genes that traced their origins to events no one remembered. By the time the ice began to melt again and the seas rose once more, the fate of these archaic humans had already been sealed. Their numbers dwindled. Their last members likely died out not through violence, but through the slow erosion of time and the overwhelming presence of expanding modern human groups. Yet their influence endured, quiet, small, but persistent. When the Torres Strait finally flooded around 8,000 years ago, separating Australia and New Guinea forever, the stage was set for the world we know today. The ancient continent of Sahul broke apart, but the genetic stories embedded in its people remained, and the D1 Denisovans, though long gone, continued to exist in fragments carried by the descendants of those who once lived beside them. Their story was not erased, only hidden, waiting for a future science capable of revealing it. By the time the last remnants of the D1 Denisovans faded from the highlands, the people living in New Guinea had already begun shaping one of the most complex cultural landscapes on Earth. The valleys that once shielded those archaic groups now sheltered growing human communities whose rhythms of life were tightly woven into the geography around them. Rivers that wound down from alpine ridges fed dense gardens. Forests provided game, tools, fibers, and medicines, and the mountains, with their unpredictable weather and dramatic cliffs, offered both barriers and protection. As the climate warmed after the Ice Age, these highland societies didn't simply survive, they flourished. Archaeological evidence shows some of the earliest examples of long-term agriculture emerging in these valleys, thousands of years before domesticated crops appeared in many other parts of the world. People grew taro, bananas, yams, and sugarcane in carefully managed plots. They built drainage systems and terraced slopes, transforming rugged terrain into sustainable fields. This was not a brief experiment, but a continuous tradition that lasted for millennia. In those same valleys, the ancient Denisovan signatures, D1 and the older D2, continued to persist quietly in human DNA, threaded through lineages shaped by small, interconnected communities. These genetic echoes didn't fade because the highlands themselves acted as a kind of amplifier. Isolated populations can hold on to rare genetic traits far longer than large, mixing populations where such signatures often vanish. And because families tended to stay near their ancestral lands, the genetic map of the region thickened with these deep, archaic strands. Meanwhile, life at lower elevations was changing in different ways. Coastal groups adapted to shifting shorelines, tidal systems, and rich marine environments. They traveled waterways, built early forms of seafaring technology, and exchanged goods with neighboring islands. These interactions created cultural networks that stretched across the region long before the first great ocean migrations that would later populate the Pacific. But what remained most striking was the contrast between the coast and the highlands. In the lowlands, populations were more mobile, more fluid, more exposed to environmental changes. In the mountains, communities were anchored by geography, tied to valleys that offered both abundance and isolation. This contrast created a natural divide in language, traditions, and genetics, one that persists to this day. As sea levels continued to rise, the geography of northern Australia and southern New Guinea shifted dramatically. Land bridges that had stood for tens of thousands of years slipped beneath the water. Entire ecosystems vanished, replaced by mangrove swamps and shallow seas. The game herds that once roamed the plains moved or disappeared entirely. The people living in those areas adapted, but the ancient connection between the two continents was gone. By the time the Torres Strait fully formed, the population histories of Australia and New Guinea had already moved in separate directions. Aboriginal Australians carried only the more ancient Denisovan traces from the early D2 encounter. Their cultural and genetic stories unfolded across deserts, woodlands, and coastal regions that demanded resilience and mobility. In contrast, Papuan ancestors carried both Denisovan layers, the older D2 and the younger D1, from events separated by tens of thousands of years. Yet none of the people living in these regions would have known any of this. To them, their world was shaped not by long-lost genetic exchanges, but by weather, land, and tradition. Their stories explained their origins in ways rooted in landscape and spirit, not in migrations across vanished continents. Their knowledge systems preserved deep relationships with the environment, seasons, and each other. Still, even without understanding the biological history that led them there, they lived out the consequences of those ancient encounters. The Denisovan genes that lingered in highland populations may have shaped immunity to diseases carried by insects or animals. They may have contributed to how the body handles oxygen at higher altitudes or metabolizes certain foods. These were quiet, invisible influences, not dramatic transformations, but subtle advantages in a challenging environment. In a place where survival depended on the smallest edge, those ancient fragments mattered. As generations passed, cultures became more elaborate. Kinship systems grew more complex. Oral histories stretched back centuries. Communities developed distinct identities with rituals, music, art, trade, and conflict, all shaped by the terrain that had sheltered their ancestors. And through all these changes, the genetic legacy of D1 and D2 remained locked within the people themselves, unnoticed but enduring. The Denisovans were long gone, but their story was far from over. Hidden within the very DNA of the Highlanders was a record no myth had preserved, a memory encoded in biology rather than words. It waited patiently through tens of thousands of years, knowing nothing of the modern science that would one day read it like a book. It wasn't until the 21st century that researchers, using fragments of genetic code found in living populations, were finally able to reconstruct the existence of this vanished lineage, a lineage that had survived in the mountains long after its relatives elsewhere had disappeared. The D1 Denisovans lived on not through bones or artifacts, but through people who had carried their traces across countless generations. Their story would never have been discovered without the help of those alive today. The realization that an entire branch of archaic humans had been hiding in plain sight within modern genomes reshaped what scientists thought they knew about human origins. It reminded researchers that the Pacific was never an isolated backwater, but a crossroads where different human lineages survived, adapted, and ultimately merged. Yet even with this revelation, the story of the D1 Denisovans feels incomplete, more like a doorway than a conclusion. Every new genetic study adds a few more brushstrokes, revealing how complicated the ancient world truly was. Instead of clean lines and simple migrations, the human story looks more like overlapping waves, some pushing outward, others retreating, and still others stuck in pockets of land where time seemed to slow. The highlands of New Guinea were one of those pockets, and the people who lived there carried forward the echoes of encounters long forgotten. When researchers examined the genomes of present-day Papuan groups, especially those living at higher elevations, they found that Denisovan DNA wasn't scattered evenly. Instead, it appeared in concentrated patches, clusters of genes that seemed to serve specific biological roles. Some of these fragments affected immune response, helping the body manage infections that thrive in humid tropical environments. Others influenced how oxygen is used in the bloodstream, a trait crucial for surviving at high altitude where the air thins. These adaptations did not come from chance. They were shaped by generations of people living with harsh realities. Highlands life involved constant movement through steep valleys, unpredictable rainfall, food scarcity, and exposure to diseases carried by insects and animals. In such conditions, a slight biological advantage could determine whether a family line thrived or faded away. The Denisovan contributions became part of that survival toolkit, woven into the physiology of communities that endured against the odds. Meanwhile, cultural landscapes continued to evolve in ways just as intricate as the genetics. As populations grew, groups split into smaller clans, each with its own rituals, songs, and systems of meaning. Over thousands of years, this fragmentation produced the astonishing linguistic diversity that New Guinea is known for today. Hundreds of languages, each mapping its own history of migrations, alliances, and separations. These languages became living archives, carrying knowledge of land, plants, animals, and ancestry. And yet, in all those stories, there is no clear memory of the D1 Denisovans, no myths that scholars can confidently trace to them, no oral histories that describe a people who were almost human, yet not quite the same. If the last Denisovans were remembered at all, they likely became folded into broader tales of spirits, ancestors, or beings who lived in the mountains before humans did. Over time, distinctions blurred. What had once been a real encounter faded into legend, and then into silence. Still, the land itself holds clues. The highlands are filled with rock shelters, ridgelines, and ancient paths carved by people long before agriculture took root. Some of these places may have been visited by both modern humans and Denisovans at different times, though without bones or tools it is impossible to know. The acidic soils erase physical evidence quickly, leaving behind only the stone and earth. But the absence of artifacts does not mean the absence of history. It simply means the story survived in a different form. As sea levels reached their modern heights, New Guinea became truly isolated from Australia. The two populations that had once been part of a single Sahul world now lived in separate ecological realms. On the Australian side, groups adapted to deserts and coastlines, maintaining traditions that stretched back tens of thousands of years. On the New Guinea side, highland societies became increasingly stratified, with complex social structures and ritual systems. And through all these transformations, the D1 ancestry persisted only where geography allowed it to take root. Modern technology finally unlocked the secret that the highlands had held for so long. When sequencing machines first read the DNA of Denisovans from a single finger bone in Siberia, no one expected that the story would lead to New Guinea. But as scientists compared genomes from across the world, the clue stood out. Papuans carried far more Denisovan DNA than any other population, and deeper still was the surprise that not all of this ancestry came from the same Denisovan group. The D1 lineage, older, isolated, genetically unique, emerged from the data like a ghost sweeping across the Pacific. It was proof that the ancient world had been populated by far more diverse human groups than anyone had imagined. These lineages didn't simply vanish because they were weak or outcompeted. Some disappeared because rising seas erased their habitats. Others were absorbed into larger populations, and still others, like the D1 Denisovans, likely dwindled slowly as small, fragile communities until finally the last of them blended into the expanding human groups around them. The idea that a lost human lineage survived into the late Ice Age, tucked away in the cloud forests of New Guinea, challenges older views of human evolution. It shows that the borders between us and them were never sharp. The world our ancestors walked was full of other humans with whom they shared encounters, sometimes violent, sometimes peaceful, sometimes intimate enough to leave a lasting legacy. In the end, the D1 Denisovans left no tools, no carvings, no settlements we can point to. Their existence is not etched into caves or preserved in soil. It is carried only in the DNA of millions of people who never knew they were keeping an ancient lineage alive. Through them, the last chapter of the Denisovans continues into the present, a story told not in myths, but in molecules. And that story reminds us of something profound. The map of human origins is far from complete. Every new discovery adds depth, complicates the narrative, and expands the horizon of what is possible. Somewhere hidden in the genetics of small, isolated communities or buried beneath tropical forests, other lost groups may still be waiting to be found. The ancient world was vast, and so many of its people left no trace but the echoes carried forward in us. The D1 Denisovans are one of those echoes, faint, fragile, and irreplaceable, a lineage that survived against all odds, met our ancestors in a mountain world, and now exists only as a whisper inside the genome. Their disappearance was quiet, unnoticed by anyone at the time. But their legacy endures, proof that human history has always been deeper, stranger, and more interconnected than we once believed. Even as the D1 Denisovans vanished from the highlands, the people who carried their genes continued to thrive, building a world that balanced isolation with connection. Valleys became interlinked through careful travel along mountain ridges and rivers, allowing families to exchange goods, stories, and, occasionally, genetic material. Over generations, networks of trade emerged. Stone tools, shells, and pigments moved between communities, weaving an invisible web of cultural continuity across rugged terrain. While these exchanges left tangible traces, the silent inheritance of Denisovan DNA persisted beneath the surface, shaping the very biology of Highland peoples in ways no one could see. Life in the Highlands demanded resilience. Steep slopes and fast-flowing rivers meant that everyday survival was a challenge. People learned to cultivate slopes with terraces that held water and soil. Crops like taro and yams thrived in these microclimates, while nearby forests offered wild game and edible plants. Knowledge of the land became essential for survival, passed from parent to child, generation to generation, alongside the genes of long-lost Denisovans. In this way, cultural adaptation and genetic inheritance work together, forming a feedback loop of survival and resilience. The D1 legacy was subtle yet profound. Genes that may have influenced immunity, metabolism, and tolerance to altitude were not dominant traits that reshaped populations overnight. Instead, they acted like tiny nudges, helping people survive in the challenging highland environment. Over tens of thousands of years, these small advantages accumulated, giving communities a resilience that allowed them to persist where many other archaic lineages had disappeared.